Welcome! It's time to celebrate the season of tricks and treats!
So what's your podcast about?
Oh, it's about psychology, true crime, supernatural stuff, the occasional paranormal or philosophical rant.
Well, maybe I could check it out sometime.
If we believe this thing we call the Bible is inspired, and we believe things like God decided, these are God's decisions. God decided to prompt individuals to produce this thing we call the Bible.
These angels, it fell onto the earth, while some claim it as legend, others say it is true.
But tonight, we shall hurl the gauntlet of science into the frightful face of death itself.
But we have to realize the Bible, while it was written for us, it was not written to us. It was written to somebody else. And if we rightly understand that, then we will know that we're applying things correctly, and we will be able to understand more of Scripture.
A story, a truth, to throw the chains off forever. My master designed every tool imaginable to destroy every facet of the enemy's creation. My master realized that man still wants to be his own God and to serve no one but himself. The enemy's creation, man still wants to be his own God.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mesdames et Messieurs, Damen und Herren, for what you are about to see next, we must enter quietly into the realm of genius. Into the realm of genius.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural. Some nights I open the Bible and it feels less like reading, and more like I'm being read. The words stare back, steady as candlelight, and ancient as the people it was written by. It's not a manual, it's not a myth, it's something alive. Something watching. And if I'm honest, sometimes that unnerves me. Today we like to keep Scripture safe, bounded in leather and underlined with study notes, and explained away by polite sermons. But the people who first heard these words, wrote these words, didn't live in a world that was so safe and manicured. They lived in one alive with presence, where wind carried voices, angels walked unannounced, and shadows seemed to have meaning. They didn't need a celebration like Halloween to remind them the veil was thin. They lived in that liminal place. And when I try to read the Bible through their eyes, I realize how modern I am, how allergic I may have grown to mystery. Today we analyze, but they listened. Today we debate theology, but they feared the living God. And sometimes we edit out the strange. But in all of it, they found him in it. Maybe that's what anthropology does for me. It lets me walk back into their world for a moment, to feel the dirt underfoot, the smoke from a charcoal fire in my lungs, and that hush that fell upon the people when the prophet spoke. They weren't trying to impress us with their doctrine. They were surviving the encounter. And those encounters, they weren't all gentle. There were ghosts in those pages. Spirits that cry from the ground. Monsters. Giants born of pride. Men who meet angels and walk away forever changed. These aren't campfire tales. They're the echoes of people who saw what we can't. And maybe if I sit still quietly, I can still hear that echo. Once, I used to think faith was supposed to tame the world, to make it bright and ordered. But the older I get, the more I think faith means learning to see the chaos and still trust that God speaks through it all. The Bible itself is full of that tension. Light, darkness, miracle, terror. The holy and the haunted, side by side. And it doesn't seem to be there to comfort our modern sensibilities, but to wake them up. Occasionally, I'll read it now like a field investigator, and how they may read a case file, studying the patterns or the witnesses and the traces left behind. Except, in this case, it isn't about proof. It's about experiencing the presence. It's about remembering that this world isn't silent. It's crowded with memory, meaning, and mystery. When I open those pages, I don't merely meet history. I meet the living and the dead, the fallen and the redeemed, and somewhere in between I meet myself. Trying to make sense of it all under some dim light. And every now and then the word looks back through the darkness and lets me know that I was never meant to understand it all. And that's what keeps me coming back. Not for certainty, but for the wonder. Because beneath every story of dread and deliverance, I hear the same heartbeat. Steady, patient, divine. A reminder that even in a haunted world, we are not abandoned. That the same God who walked through their night walks through ours. And that maybe the fear we feel in the dark is just our soul's way of knowing that he's not too far away. In the end, maybe the Bible isn't just a record of what happened. Maybe it's what still happens. When the veil thins and the human heart dares to listen. It's the story of a world that never stopped trembling at the sound of its maker's voice. The anthropology of it, the study of those first hearers, reminds me that faith was never meant to be sterile. It was meant to be lived, with dirt under your fingernails and wonder in your very bones. Those ancient people didn't study the supernatural. They walked through it. And if we have the courage to see as they saw, maybe we'll find that same presence that still moves in the dark, not to frighten us, but to remind us that the unseen is real.
When most of us open the Bible, we think we're stepping into familiar territory. We read the stories, we memorize the verses, we hear the sermons. But if we're honest, we're reading with modern eyes. We filter the text through the categories of Western science, modern theology, and tidy Sunday school lessons. So today we're going to ask, what happens when we bring anthropology to the table of biblical studies? What do we uncover when we let cultures of the ancient Near East speak? To guide us, I'm joined by Dr. Judd Burton, anthropologist, historian, and scholar of the unseen realm. Together, we'll explore how anthropology helps us uncover the cultural DNA of the Bible and why that matters for faith today. Dr. Judd, welcome back to Truth and Shadow Podcast.
Thank you, Brandon. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. I'd love to start with you. What was it that drew you specifically to the anthropology in the first place within the Bible, not anthropology as an entire school or a study, but that part that led you into the biblical studies journey?
Well, my undergraduate degree was in history, and a lot of the schooling that I got as an undergraduate was sort of a combination of my history and historiographical classes and classes that I was taking from the seminary that was attached to the university. And I already had an eye towards the ancient world, but knew that that there weren't not that there weren't scholars that hadn't looked at the Bible with anthropology before. I just noticed that it was sort of on the periphery in terms of what in terms of methodology and theory being applied to the biblical world. And in a way, to be fair, most scholars and students of the Bible that look at the Bible and its culture are doing anthropology of one sort or another. So whether they're a historian or a paleographer, looking at the text, looking at the languages, that's one aspect. The archaeologist is trying to build a culture narrative of whatever site or whatever cluster of sites that person is working on. So they're working with material remains, features of buildings and structures and artifacts like in the Holy Land. Those that are especially helpful would be potsherds and pieces of ancient weapons and vessels and all kinds of things help give us a diagnostic picture of what's going on. And that's a kind of anthropology in and of itself, because the subject or subjects that we're trying to talk to are human. In other words, we're trying to have that in a way that an ethnographer or a cultural anthropologist would sit down and interview somebody. We're all really trying to do the same thing. We're just using slightly different methods in order to reconstruct that. But that use of anthropology is applied to the biblical text, outside of probably the most popular use of anthropology to study the Bible, that being archaeology as a subfield of anthropology. It was sort of, particularly the comparative ethnological methods, it was just sort of the I don't want to say last resort, but it was definitely on the periphery until really the end of the last century, beginning of the 21st century. You definitely had some strides in the field of classics and ancient studies in the early part of the 20th century towards the middle of the century, in persons like Ward Fowler and Moses Finley, who wrote on the ancient Roman and Greek worlds, respectively. But they, along with people like Andrew Lang in the previous century, had started to use anthropology to see what they could glean from the Roman and the Greek worlds. And that methodology was sort of adopted by biblical scholars and historians to try and do the same sorts of things. And so that once I discovered it, that sort of approach to the Bible, looking at it in the cultural context, letting the language say what it says, and perhaps more importantly, letting it say what it says in the context of writer and audience. because this was collectively, the Bible was certainly written for us, but it was not written to us. And so these sorts of questions were very interesting and I thought very useful to me. And so I'll never forget the last, probably my senior year, the last year of my undergraduate studies. I just grabbed an anthropology text and just sort of, before I considered even going into a program, I just sort of familiarized myself with the field and its subdisciplines, and considered what those subdisciplines might actually have in terms of their usefulness for biblical studies. And of course, that was something that I fleshed out in some degree in my study of the anthropology of religion as a graduate student in the anthropology department at Texas Tech. So that's a nutshell version of how a lot of these at the end of the day really methodological questions came up on my radar, and why anthropology I thought would be a useful tool.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, see, I think when people hear that word anthropology, and you spoke a little bit about, cultural anthropology, which is the study of living cultures, and then you mentioned archaeology, which is basically the study of the remains, and then these are all parts and parcels of the greater anthropology.
Sure.
But it's much bigger than that. And so how would you describe specifically anthropology as it relates to how we read the Bible?
Well, you mentioned two of the main subfields. They're ethnology or cultural anthropology and archaeology, and the other two are biological anthropology, which has to do with basically human osteology and paleontology, and linguistics, often in the form of historical or sociolinguistics. And linguistics is important because it's not just the study of one language, it's the study of how languages operate, sort of the connective tissue, the shared ideas that linguists call cognates between words. It's the tracing of the traveling of languages and the development and evolution of languages over time. And I'll give you a recent example of how I think that historical linguistics has been a useful tool in biblical studies, and it has to do with the case of the Tower of Babel mentioned in Genesis. And one of the prevailing ideas right now amongst archaeologists is that the Tower of Babel was at a site in ancient Mesopotamia called Eridu. And Eridu is one of the older. There's a lot of those cities in Mesopotamia, particularly southern Mesopotamia, are quite old. They have foundations that predate the Sumerian settlements of those places. The previous Ubaid, the Ubaid culture were actually the first ziggurat builders and sort of cloistered proto cities, if you will, in the region. And so some of these monuments date back to this very early period, that date back as early as 5500 BC or so. And Eridu is, along with other places like Uruk and Ur, also have similar beginnings. And so archaeologists that I have great respect for, archaeologists and historians like Dr. Doug Petrovich and the Egyptologist David Roll and a number of individuals. And I'm not besmirching their opinion because I regard and respect them as peers in my field. They've identified Eridu as the probable site for the Tower of Babel because of the unfinished ziggurat there and its potential antiquity. And I get it. It's convenient to do that. It's the story of Babel in Genesis is presented in the context of Shinar, what the Levantines, the Hebrews called Mesopotamia. But there's a key component that's really not factored into this conclusion, and I know that it has to have weighed on the minds of not just the fellows that I mentioned, but scholars who have pondered this question for centuries, is that locating Babel in Lower Mesopotamia has a major problem, and it's a linguistic one, because you don't, in the story of Babel, there is a great blossoming of languages. It's recounted as the confusion of languages, but accompanying that is something that anthropologists call ethnogenesis, and the magnitude of ethnogenesis, the creation of these new societies, does not conform to a theory that concludes that Eridu is the biblical Babel. It's just not there. I mean, there's maybe half a dozen languages spoke there, and that's including the kind of the dialects that you're going to get. And I have argued over the last year and a half so that a better location for Babel is farther north in northern Mesopotamia, and what would today be the region of eastern Turkey, Armenia, maybe as far north as Georgia, because there is a linguistic phenomenon that takes place between 6,000 and 4,000 years BC called the Proto-Indo-European language shift. And so there are a number of proto-languages in Central Asia, Eurasia. There are a couple that actually predate Proto-Indo-European, but for all intents and purposes, at one point in time, let's just say early post-flood, we were all speaking dialects of the same language. And so, it makes, as an anthropologist looking at the problem linguistically, it just doesn't make sense to locate it in Lower Mesopotamia when you've got a much better and chartable linguistic phenomenon taking place in the region that I just mentioned, where Eastern Turkey, Armenia, and sort of the Transcaucasus region, this area that birthed the lion's share of languages in Europe and Asia. And so I would look at the monuments of early Neolithic, Eastern Turkey, Central Turkey, as a better location. And of course, as you know, that area of Turkey, ancient Anatolia, is producing a large number of these Mesolithic, early Neolithic finds. And the ones that make the headlines are places like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. Clearly, sophisticated societies existed long before scholars have contended that they did in this region. And so my advice, not just to myself, because this is a problem that I'm still tackling, but to other scholars and even students of the Bible of all make, is to keep your eye on Eastern Turkey, because my prediction is that the finds that keep coming out of this region of ancient Anatolia will reveal themselves to be part of the Babel process or the Babel working. Because we're not just talking about a brick and mortar operation. I mean, there was that. That's clearly outlined. But there's clearly a ritual. There's a ritual process that's going on here too. And so this is one example of how anthropology can be applied to the biblical text and perhaps bring some things to light and illuminate some things that have not gotten a lot of attention beforehand.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting rabbit hole to follow. Kind of disappear into Alice in Wonderland for a second. Places like Karahan Tepe and the frequency of things like the serpent, the presence of serpent-like entities out of Lake Van in that area around there. I mean, we're all talking about places that are really close to where Noah's Ark lands in the Ararat mountain range. And this Tower of Babel event would be a gathering, a rebellion of something, and a gathering in one place. And you're right; these areas in Old Anatolia definitely seem to fit. And I think we can learn about humans of those times by some of the things they left behind. We can't ignore the prevalence of animals on the T-shaped pillars. We can't, or serpent worship, which is really old, ancient, prevalent in a lot of cultures. And this is all stuff that seems to tell us about the story of man.
Sure.
What would we do if we were to basically drop us there into chapter 11 of Genesis? What are we experiencing?
Well, that setting, in my mind, has to be more geographically proximate to, as you pointed out, the place where Noah's descendants would have begun to spread into other parts of the world. And that begs the question is, as some people have done, although it's not explicitly laid out in the text, some people have likened not just the Tower of Babel, but the sort of magical workings that went along with it, have brought this into the purview of Nimrod, arguably the first Antichrist figure to crop up in the Bible. We're not altogether certain that that's the case. But certainly Nimrod's earlier forebears, in the line of Canaan and Arphaxad, and it makes sense that their kingdoms would be in this northern part as well. And so there's some interesting apocryphal insights, like from the Book of Jubilees, about Arphaxad's, who is, of course, mentioned in the genealogy there as part of the line of Nimrod. Arphaxad rediscovers the Watcher writing scrawled on a rock, essentially, and uses it to build whatever that knowledge was. He used it to build his empire, ostensibly the one that Nimrod inherits. And so, what we may be looking at in terms of, let's say, something like the Gilgamesh epic, if there's anything to, we even get references to Gilgamesh in the Book of Giants. If there's anything to Gilgamesh just being another identity of Nimrod, like, Amraphel or some of the other names that are ascribed to him, then what we may be seeing in Mesopotamian literature, and it's hard to put a timeline on that anyways. You look at the Sumerian kings list, and it's almost impossible to reckon, how long these kings lived and when they were on the earth. But what I think we may be looking at is something that's wasn't originally set in, let's say, 4th or 3rd millennium BC Mesopotamia, but we're looking at a memory that's recorded and mythologized in the literature of a later period when it could be written down, when there were explicit systems of writing to do that. Again, it's an interesting time to be alive, considering everything that's coming out of Eastern Turkey, even strides that we've made in, Assyriology and Sumeriology. I think that more and more is going to come to light about how relevant that region is, and how reliable and how historical the Genesis account is in affirming real events in a real time, in a real place. So again, I can't stress to people enough, pay attention to Eastern Turkey, Armenia, the Transcaucasus, northern Iran even.
Yeah, that makes an interesting theory too, because if we look at, I was looking at with Karahan Tepe, they're talking about that one being 9,600 years old.
Right.
Maybe more, which is interesting because I do believe in France still holds the oldest cave art, rock art, and that's at Lascaux.
Lascaux. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so it's kind of an interesting look at how far back that is and how far away they are, France, from Eastern Turkey and, the whole Transcaucasus Mountains. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about because they too were obsessed with animals.
Sure. Well, and the last I heard about the Lascaux Caves, there was a graduate student who thought that she had found a discernible language in the images that were drawn at the Lascaux Caves. I can't remember if anything came of it, but clearly it marks an increase in the sophistication of the recording of observable events. Now, as to, again, the world of prehistory is tricky because we don't have anything written that we know of anyway. I think, as a footnote to that, it may, in time, it may prove that, what I'm thinking of are some Luvian logograms that were found in Göbekli Tepe. And Luvian is an interesting language. It was spoken by another language that was spoken by the Hittites, but the people on the west coast of Asia, the people from Ilios, the Trojans, also spoke Luvian. But there are a couple of these logograms that have been found, or what appear to be logograms found at Göbekli Tepe. If that's true, we may have to completely redate the origins of what we consider Luvian. It may be a rediscovered language at the end of the day. But what I was getting at is that it's hard to chart the role that supernatural entities played the farther back in time we go. I mean, we don't know. Clearly, they were active in prehistory to some degree. And that's one of the arguments that Aaron Judkins and I made in our recent book on Göbekli Tepe. But that's a place I think we need to tread carefully. And there's a way to do that too. I'm constantly telling people that we subscribe to a supernatural worldview, and that means a whole lot of weirdness, but it doesn't mean that we abandon reason either. So there's a sort of balanced approach, I think, that renders the best results. And but on that note, I'm really just following not only what I was taught and how I was trained, but I'm following in the footsteps of people like the late Dr. Mike Heiser,
Right.
who advocated the same approach.
Yeah, and here's one of the things that's interesting to me is we have anthropologists of a lot of branches. They come together and they study ritual and myth. And so they take the rituals, they take the myths of the culture. And since we're in the Levant, we're going to stick around there. That's probably the easiest to just kind of stay in that fertile area. And we have a development from Genesis 11 into the time that Abram appears. And when God calls Abram out of his land, he interacts with this El Shaddai, this God figure, in a way that's kind of similar to the peoples of the era, the peoples of the times. But we're going to start seeing his behaviors are quite a bit different. Can we talk about how some of these covenants and the things that are different within the Abram interaction with the supernatural?
Certainly. Abraham is another interesting case out of Anatolia. It's sometimes easy to overlook the fact that he was called from Haran, and again, I think his Ur of the Chaldees in most translations, but Ur Kasdim in the Hebrew is not Ur of southern Mesopotamia. It just doesn't make sense. The two candidates that I think are the best are either Shanlurfa near Göbekli Tepe or Kesh is another really good another potential. But in that entire region during Abraham's time, which ostensibly is the Middle Bronze Age, probably as early as probably 2200 BC, as late as 1800 BC is sort of the window that most people would start the patriarchal period. But yeah, Abraham is ostensibly part of a legacy in the worship of these deities. His father, if we're to look at the text anthropologically, I think his father was a priest to this moon god, who is evinced archaeologically at Urkesh. So Abraham receives this revelation from a god who goes by titles, which is not exceptional in the ancient Near East, but as you pointed out, his demeanor is different. If you look at the mythology of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean, and really mythology worldwide, you'll find that the gods are a rather capricious lot, and their fealty demands a kind of tit for tat, immediate gratification. They clearly, as gods of the nations, as outlined in the Psalms, they've got their own agendas, but they're not really always that forthcoming with the people that follow them and give their sons and daughters as sacrifices to them, which is another thing that really separates these gods from the God that calls Abraham. And I think the passages that talk about Abraham, God calling Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, not only is a foreshadowing of things to come, but he demonstrates in this vivid way how different he is from these other bloodthirsty gods in these pantheons in the ancient Near East. And so the as you point out, the covenantal structure is markedly different in terms of the worship of Yahweh, who becomes known as Yahweh, and these other deities, whether it's Marduk or Baal or Asherah or Ashtaroth, Molech, Chemosh, they're all bloodthirsty in one form or fashion. And it's when Abraham's descendants dilly-dally with these gods of the nations that they run into trouble when they veer outside of that covenant. But clearly, one of the things that demarcates El Shaddai from, let's say, the pantheon of gods that Abraham and his family had left was the length of vision, the longitude of vision. Not just because God is God, but because he had a plan to grow and benefit the people that followed him, because he wanted a family. And that's really not what these other pantheons care about. Their interactions with humans are self-serving and capricious, even when they do exhibit what we might call, something like moral behavior or virtue. It's still for their own selfish ends. And so very early on, there's this delineation between the behavior and the identity of the God that Abraham follows and these other gods, these other Elohim that the surrounding peoples are following.
Yeah, it's something is really interesting going on there because of the comparisons, and contrast between, like you said, any kind of Mesopotamian belief system, any kind of, even later pantheons that come along, Greek myth, Roman myth, they still fall into this behavior that, humans are to serve them. And it's not this way with the God that calls Abraham. And when we look at that, when we look at what we're doing here, and we're comparing what would become the Hebrew people, we're not at the people of Israel yet, but these Hebrew people, if we're looking at them and comparing them with other cultures at the time. So something that strikes me here as we're talking about the Hebrew culture, and we're comparing that time and those people with, say, other cultures, are we taking and basically reducing these chapters in Genesis into just another myth? And that kind of question leads to, how do you respond to that?
No, I don't think it's a reduction to myth in the strictest sense. I think there are definitely mythological elements to it. In a lot of ways, myth is the mother tongue for humanity. So there are certain things like literary practices and tropes that end up in the Bible that their neighbors would have used, that doesn't completely mythologize or even take away the theological impact of the scripture. But again, this is also, I think, a question of authorship. In the case of Moses, who arguably he's really when you think about it, he's really the first Western historian. Long before Herodotus writes his histories in the 5th century, Moses is writing this stuff down, maybe as early as the 15th or 16th century BC. There's some people who posit that it's earlier than that. At any rate, he's got about a millennium jump on Herodotus. And we also have to remember that for his day, Moses was a pretty educated fellow. He was trained in the Egyptian court, which meant he got the creme de la creme of education. So, we can argue that he took what he learned there and built into the first 5 books of the Bible a structure of what historians have copied ever since then. And we know that because of periods of Orientalizing in trade and diffusion between the Levant and the Greek world, the Eastern Aegean world, that there were certainly artistic and aesthetic influences on pottery and vases that were sold, but also in the intellectual tradition that developed in ancient Greece. So they certainly had some access to those ideas from the ancient Levant that included the Hebraic one. And so, if you look at the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, you've got everything that a comprehensive historian, and for that matter, an anthropologist, would be concerned with: the history of your people, the religion of your people, the family, the very exacting, comprehensive family histories of your people, and the epic journey from southern Anatolia to where they were on the cusp of the Holy Land. You can find all of that there. And, Moses is very exact in his geographical depictions of the places that they're at. And this is something that he sets down very early on when he talks about Eden. He knew exactly, he's doing what John did with his vision of the end of time. Moses is seeing the beginning of time, and he's using his education to put it all into context for people. And so he knows exactly where the country of Eden was, where the Garden of Eden was. It was in Anatolia. It was in Turkey. And he knew specifically what rivers were associated with the region. So, with all the care that we think that historians like Herodotus and Thucydides and Xenophon paid, all the attention that they paid to detail in their accounts, you can find the same thing in the first 5 books of the Bible, and by proxy, the rest of the Bible. So, I don't look to Western Civ or World Civ textbooks anytime soon pointing to Moses as the father of Western history. But realistically, when you look at it, that's really where the tradition begins. And so Moses is an important figure in the articulation of Hebrew culture and Hebrew history, the history of his people.
Yeah, absolutely. You've written quite a bit about the supernatural in the Bible, from Interview with the Giant and I believe the Nephilim dossier. So modern readers often domesticate or explain away that unseen realm stuff. So with anthropology, with that as a science, how do we take that and re-enter into that world where angels, giants, spirits weren't just, metaphors or Jungian archetypes, but they were literally part of their daily life?
Sure. Well, and that's the consequence of the Enlightenment, materialism, postmodernism, the commodification of culture, the peripheralization of the supernatural, which was a central component of cultures and has been for virtually all of human history. This secularist society that we've created is something of an anomaly in human history. Be that as it may, be that as it may, mythology has always been a tricky combatant for materialistically minded individuals and scholars. What anthropology, I think, does for this conversation is that, if you look at sort of the golden age of anthropology, and even you talk to anthropologists today, they'll tell you the same thing. They're dealing with people who interact with this stuff all the time. They, especially if they're in the third world, same thing goes for missionaries. You want to learn about this stuff really quick, grab yourself a missionary and talk to them, because they deal with the supernatural day in, day out alongside these people that they're witnessing to. And it's easy to sort of write off a percentage of those experiences. And I'm talking about worldwide, not just with any one culture, but you can't write them all off, because it just takes one of them being true, one of them being something that happens in real space and time that has life-changing meaning for an individual and a culture, to just sort of, destroy the paradigm of, materialism, whatever appellation you want to give it. When we consider also that these people, because they subscribe to a supernatural worldview, because they still think mythologically in a lot of ways, they don't sort of divide their intellectual processes up like people in the modern world do, so that you end up with a sort of fast food menu style approach to your disciplines. That's really not how ancient people thought. It's not how people in non-literate, non-industrial cultures think. All of their bodies of knowledge were basically afloat on mythology, whether it was their law or philosophy or history or mathematics or what have you. It was all part of the same cohesive whole. And if people want to understand more about this, I would point them to the book Hamlet's Mill, that delves into this very deeply. But that's another problem at the crux of trying to illustrate to people that a supernatural worldview doesn't take away from a reasonable approach either. We know that mythology contains historicity beyond a shadow of a doubt. You don't have to look further than I mentioned Troy a minute ago in the context of Luvian. For centuries we thought that the city of Troy and perhaps even the Trojan War itself was just the fanciful imagination of Homer. Well, here comes Frank Calvert, and although I wouldn't give him nearly as much credit as he's given, Heinrich Schliemann, excavate the hill of Hissarlik and open that can of worms, and we found out that, there was a kingdom in Ilios. And then we found the Tawagamma letters, and we found out that, there actually was a King Priam and the Achaeans that invaded Ilios. And we know now that that's a larger part of the story of the collapse of the Bronze Age. And so in that story, that mythological story, we have contained a history, a mythologized history of real events, of real people. And you could do the same thing with, the story of Romulus in Roman mythology. Livy recounts the story of Romulus and Remus, and we have in the old the Republican era Roman historians recorded that we have the names of the first 7 kings of Rome when it was a monarchy, and the first one was Romulus. So, that mythology is historical, is clear, and that ancient peoples didn't really blur or didn't really sharply draw a line between those two is also very clear from every available diagnostic methodology we have to study them. But there persists this push, particularly in scholastic and materialistic circles, to continue to peripheralize and what I call commodify culture in order to make it somehow more palatable. But it stands in sharp opposition to the history of our species, and that we've always been a people that have subscribed to the supernatural and interacted with it.
Yeah, since you brought up the collapse of the Bronze Age there, the beginning of the Iron Age, we can actually take in place, I do believe, King Saul right around 1050. So if I remember correctly, the 1100s is kind of the break between the collapse of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, with the appearance of the sea peoples, what Phoenicians or the Philistines or however they are called. But what I'm drawing out here is something that's interesting in that time period is King Saul going and taking the quote-unquote Witch of Endor and having her summon up Samuel. And this is kind of an interesting thing because anthropologically speaking, for King Saul to do this, he had to have been aware that this was a thing. And so this was something that was in the cultures around them. Can we look at that for a minute?
Certainly. Well, the concourse with these entities, is the bedrock for ritual in basically any polytheistic religion. And again, ancient Judaism or Yahwism was the exception to the rule rather than you do find things like Yahweh represented in the archaeological record with Asherah consorts, but these are post-conquest occurrences in the archaeological record, and it's interesting now. You've got a lot of internet experts who are claiming that, this proves that the divine feminine has been erased from the narrative, and they'll say, hey, look, it's here in the archaeology, and my retort is always, yeah, it's in the archaeology post-conquest. They were told, the Hebrews were told not to have concourse with these people, and all you have to do is read the Old Testament, and it's story after story after the sort of corruptive activity. But you're right. This sort of concourse with these entities, and specifically the consultation of the dead, is not just confined to that part of the world or that time. It's been a spiritual practice for again, probably as long as humans have been around. I think it's interesting that in the case of Saul and the Witch of Endor, there's several proscriptions against necromancy, the consulting of the dead, in the Old Testament, the Levitical law, which which implies very strongly that it's possible to do that. In other words, why would there be a law that God hands down? Don't talk to the dead, because there was a mechanism for doing that very thing. And in the ancient Hebrew mind, even the spirits of the dead were considered a kind of Elohim. And the practice of consulting the dead was typically done with it's called an ob in Hebrew, but it's cognate and phonetically and morphologically similar to the avi that the Hurrians used. In fact, the city that I mentioned earlier, Urkesh, there have been archaeologists have discovered these necromantic pits that were used for that purpose. And this is a similar kind of phenomenon that you have with the Witch of Endor. She's probably using a similar kind of setup. But to circle back to your original point, it's interesting that that Saul would do this, clearly himself, having been corrupted by this point, but that somehow it was possible because other peoples were doing it, and God made a very explicit proscription against it in the Levitical laws.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing because speaking of the necromantic pits, I do believe this is where a lot of bones were discovered. Was that part of that? And what's interesting there, and what you brought it up, it kind of splashed into my mind, was the story of the prophet talking about, God was talking to him and he's like, prophesy to these bones. And it's like there's flesh and sinew and muscle, and then you command the wind to breathe into the life of these bones. And it's kind of an interesting story when you think about the necromantic pits and these, and this is where this guy is visioning like this return to life. Anyways, that was just a little off topic there, I guess, but
no, it's on topic.
If we start to see the Bible not just through the scholastic or theology or, dare I say, literature, but through anthropology, through the lens of culture, myth, and ritual, and the supernatural, what happens to our faith?
Well, speaking for me and probably other people who have gone down this path, it's enriched my faith. Because usually the stuff, the supernaturalism that gets the headlines is the negative stuff, the concourse of these negative entities. But what that means conversely is that their opponents are also real. That means that God is real. That means his angelic host is real. That means that his divine counsel is real. And again, as far as the taxonomy of the spiritual world is concerned, the fallen entities, the fallen Elohim, are not their peers. They're not their equals. We're not talking about dualism here. It's not like Zoroastrianism, where you have the Ahura Mazda and the Angramanyu equally competing against each other. It's not that at all. And so I think this is one thing that anthropology can bring to light for people, but working in tandem with established methods too. I'm just saying that I have found it useful in bringing some things to light that I don't think had been clearly articulated. And really the first laboratory for doing this for me was with the problem of the giants. the book that I wrote, Interview with the Giant, was really the precipitous, the distillates from my dissertation. You know, I had questions because I was writing about the Mount Hermon region when I wrote my dissertation about Peneus. I kept running into these, questions that I had about them. And I found anthropology to be a useful method, and thinking, well, was there a culture of the giants? Did they exhibit behaviors that distinguish them from humans, from their watcher forebears? What were the demeanors that were articulated by the authors of the Bible who interacted with them and fought against them? And these were questions that I didn't see a lot of other authors really giving. I think, not that they weren't addressing those questions, I just don't think that they were applying what Clifford Geertz used to call thick description. He wrote an entire book about detailed, ethnological study. And so for me, it's just been this continuous reaffirmation of my faith. It just like history or archaeology, it's language. It's really served to undergird my faith, and that, I think, that should be an encouragement to all peoples in Christendom, is that we're part of a tradition that has a chartable history to it. We have more text to support what we believe in than any other tradition on the face of the planet by far. It's not even a contest. We have more complete copies, ancient copies of the scriptures than we do copies of Homer. We have give or take, we have 40 some odd different authors in the ancient world that testify to the existence of Jesus and the early members of the church. So whenever these diagnostic tools can be applied to the Bible, I think it only serves to undergird someone's faith. I mean, certainly it's more blessed to believe than to just, go on the evidence, but it's really a gift from God that we do have so much, just mountains and mountains of evidence, despite, more materialistic scholars trying to reduce that just to the cultural commodities that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like if we just take the Bible and use pure philosophy, we end up with Gnosticism. And it seems like archaeology, anthropology, specifically the big umbrella of anthropology, so all four schools, can really help literally as an apologetic against that idea.
Certainly. Well, and, philosophy certainly has its place. I mean, theology is basically applying philosophy to the text. But I that's what I'm saying, is that anthropology is just one more tool to help us understand, I think, more completely the text.
What's the big takeaway you want to tell people to come away from this conversation?
I think the biggest takeaway is that, you don't have to have alphabet soup after your name to apply these different methodologies either. And, we live in a time right now where, you can fork out all the money you want to for, and they do great work. They have good software like Logos or any of a handful of other places that offer. But there's so much available now that's just free. A Blue Letter Bible is a great one. But there are so many apps out there. You don't even have to be a master in the languages, although that helps. there's only so much that the apps can do. But the thing is that, you can study the nuances of some of these passages and get them to pop clearer than just reading them in the translated form. And that is, let's say 25 years ago, when I started grad school, they were just starting to have this sort of accessibility. But now you can download this stuff to your phone and use it. And so, as the scripture says, it's the glory of God to conceal a thing. It's the glory of kings to search after it. And I would just encourage people to pursue that kind of glory, because we're so blessed to have these free libraries, because that's what they are at the end of the day. Just that 2 generations ago, our grandparents couldn't have imagined that this sort of stuff would be available. And so my advice to people is to avail yourself of it. And if you're looking to learn more about how anthropology can be applied to biblical studies, I teach coursework on that very thing.
Yeah, this is actually a good segue. So if any of the listeners are still listening and they've made it this far through this episode, why don't you go ahead and leave some of those details that'll be in the show notes?
Certainly. The Institute of Biblical Anthropology has 6 programs. The flagship program is Biblical Anthropology, but I also have Biblical Demonology. I have a World Mythology course. I have 2 courses that are basically strictly historical on the ancient Near East and Mediterranean civilization. And by far, the most popular one is the Preternatural Morphology, the Monsters 101 class, where people can learn about vampires and werewolves and chimera of all kind and look at them through the lens of the Bible.
Well, fantastic. Dr. Judd, I really appreciate you coming back on my show and talking about this with me.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.
The rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. You take the red pill. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. You stay in Wonderland. Believe whatever you want to believe.